Probably not a lot, doesn't get a lot of press out there, but I actually think it's quite an important topic. And one of the reasons I was interested in it was recently there's been a few papers on it, and it started with the antipsychotic medications. Now, as you know, we used to use Haldol quite frequently, and there was a whole second generation of antipsychotics. And they were fairly good antipsychotics, but they're mostly used for treatment in the medical field anyway, of psychosis and aggression in patients with dementia, Alzheimer's type dementia. And they are very big sellers, so they made a lot of money for the drug companies, but the majority of them were not used as antipsychotics because, you know, the number of schizophrenics compared to the number of patients on a general medical ward with dementia was quite a bit smaller. So the three that were the big sellers, I suppose, were Zyprexa or Olanzapine, Seroquel, and Risperidol. And they all make billions of dollars, and they were like some of the best sellers that these drug companies had. They drove a lot of the profits. And they were considered as effective as the first generation drugs, but with a lower risk of side effects. So they are actually used a lot for our elderly patients with dementia. The question really is, are they actually effective medications? And there's been a few trials, and they've looked at various measures, but they've also noted an increase in the number of adverse events. So in 2006, there was a paper published in the New England Journal called the KTAD, or Alzheimer's Dementia paper, which looked at this exact question. It was a 42-site double-blind placebo-controlled trial taking 421 outpatients with Alzheimer's dementia and psychosis. So they don't have schizophrenia, but they're using these antipsychotics for the treatment of agitation, aggression, that kind of thing. And it was supposed to be a kind of real-world study. That is, the primary outcome was going to be time from initial treatment to discontinuation of treatment for any reason. So basically what they're saying is that if it's effective, that's great, but if you have to discontinue it for side effects, well, that's not very good. So that's considered the same as if it wasn't effective at all. They also measured this clinical global impression of change at 12 weeks, which is another kind of global impression of how things are going. And basically these were the results. And you can see that the percent discontinuation for any reason, and remember this is blinded, so the doctor actually doesn't know if they're getting active drug or placebo. If he feels that it's not effective or it's having too many adverse reactions, he can discontinue. And at 12 weeks, you can see all of them had about an 80% rate of discontinuation. If you look at why it was being discontinued, which is the third line there, you can see that while olanzapine and risperidone, they were discontinued at 22 weeks for ineffectiveness as compared to placebo, which took 9 weeks. So clearly they had some benefit, but if you look at the discontinuation due to adverse events, the olanzapine and the risperidol were actually much worse. The Seroquel, not only was it discontinued because it was ineffective, it also had more adverse effects. So it was really, really bad. If you look at the clinical global impression of change, it wasn't statistically significant, but perhaps there was some impression that there was some benefit. So placebo only improved 21, but olanzapine, for instance, was 32. But nevertheless, the adverse effects were really intolerable, such that even though they had some effect, you couldn't use them. They had too many side effects. If you look at it graphically, this is the real-world study, which is in the top A. You can see that they all work roughly the same. So whether you put them on Seroquel or whether you put them on placebo, it all works about the same. At the end of the 12 weeks, about 80% of them have to be discontinued because these are not schizophrenics. These are demented patients. So the adverse effects which they noted, which, you know, those of us who use it frequently see all the time, is confusion, increased confusion, sedation, changes in mental status, cognitive changes, psychotic symptoms, weight gain. So some serious side effects that are associated with all of these drugs. And you've got to remember that you go on any general medical ward in this hospital, you'll have 30% of these patients on these exact drugs. They're not effective. The bottom line, though, is that it's a simple trade-off. on the one hand, maybe they're effective. On the other hand, you get a lot of intolerable side effects, such that you basically can't use any of these drugs in any kind of effective manner. But at least it didn't kill them, right? That's good, I suppose. But what does Health Canada say about it? Well, in 2005, it turns out that Health Canada sent a letter to all the professionals, so all the doctors that were practicing got this letter, and they actually say that, quote, there's an increased mortality associated with the use of atypical antipsychotics in elderly patients with dementia. Well, that's exactly who we're using these patients on. What they noted was that there was 13 placebo-controlled trials, and when you kind of put them all together, encompassing a total of 3,900 patients, remember these are placebo-controlled trials, what you see is a mean 1.6-fold increase in the death rate. So we are killing our patients. If you look at the UK, they have a very similar thing to Health Canada, which is called the MHRA, and you can look on their website. They also reviewed the data, and what they found was not only an increased risk of death, but they also showed that risperidone and olanzapine had a 3-fold increase in the risk of stroke. Their advice is that these drugs should not be used for behavioral problems in older patients with dementia. If you look at the FDA, so not only Canada and England, but also in the United States, for olanzapine, risperidone, and Seroquel, they have a black box warning, and they note that there is an increased mortality in elderly patients with dementia-related psychosis. And the hazard ratio is 1.6 to 1.7. In other words, approximately a 60% increased risk of death. Zyprexa, they note, is not approved for the treatment of patients with dementia-related psychosis. If you look at the strokes, these are the data that they were looking at. Those trials, you put them all together at the bottom, you can see that the risk of stroke is about 3 times the risk of placebo. The risk of death was looked at in this paper published in JAMA. So after the FDA came out with the warning, these doctors went out and said, well, let's take a look at this. And they looked at all the trials that they could find. And there's about 15 trials, but of note, 9 of these were unpublished trials. Because if you have to think, how is it that this was all missed for so long? Well, they looked at everything that was available, and a lot of it actually was not available to the doctors. So they looked at 3,353 patients, and there was a clear increased risk in deaths, 118 deaths in the drug group versus 40 in the placebo group. And the odds ratio of death was 1.54, so pretty close to what all these government agencies are saying, which is about a 50, 60, 70% increase in your death when you're using these drugs off-label for the treatment of psychosis in demented patients, which is what we're doing all the time. But this is 7 years ago. This is 7 years ago that they sent out all these warnings. Yet here we are in 2012, and we still do it. Not only do we do it, we do it all the time. This is the data that they were looking at. So those are all the trials, and you can see it doesn't come out very well, but there's a line in the middle here, which is at 1.0, and you can see that virtually all the trials, even though they're not statistically significant, virtually all the trials show an increased risk of death. When you put them all together, what you do find is that there is a statistically significant increase in the risk of death with the use of these antipsychotic drugs. But do they actually work? They looked at these trials also to see how long it took for them to discontinue these drugs. And again, these are all placebo-controlled drugs, and at the bottom you can see the overall result, in fact, falls right on the line. So there really is no benefit from the use of these drugs. They are not effective. People had to stop them. When you don't know whether it's a placebo or active drug, these things get stopped all the time, and they get stopped at the same frequency as placebo. They are no more effective. The doctors who were treating the patients didn't feel they were any more effective than taking placebo. And here we are using them all the time. So they note that, first of all, that the majority of trials were actually unpublished, and that's how you can hide a lot of bad data. And they note that most of the published trials had been actually completed for several years, and the publication was long overdue. In other words, they were probably being suppressed. Nobody was trying to publish these trials showing the increased risk of death. The unpublished trials, when they looked at them, they said they were of similar quality, and all of them but one were sponsored by drug manufacturers. The death rates between the unpublished and the published ones also did not differ materially. So, it is totally mind-boggling to think that not only are these drugs completely ineffective, as in even when you use them they don't work, but they're also killing your patients. That's terrible. That's like a terrible drug. And yet you can go on any ward in this hospital and find like all these patients taking these drugs. What they did basically was they didn't publish the unfavorable trials. So, if you're thinking about a diabetic hypertensive dialysis patient, which somebody comes in and prescribes Seroquel for, the question is, do you think they're suddenly schizophrenic? Or are you ignoring Health Canada? Are you trying to kill them? Or are you just stupid? Because I hope it's D, because B and C are like criminal. It's crazy that this stuff is like from 2005, and I still have to go around and stop all the Seroquel because it's like killing people. And why do they do it? Well, because it's big money, right? Nobody's ever told doctors what you're not supposed to prescribe. So let's take the case of antidepressants. So another case study is antidepressants. They're big money. They're very big money. So there is major depressive episodes, or MDE, which is defined by the DSM-4, and that's very severe depression. The question is, do they really work for lesser forms of depression? Dysthymia, a little bit of sadness, I'm on dialysis, I'm a little sad now, you should be on an antidepressant. Do they work? Well, they're big money, right? So Effexor, Celexa, Zoloft, they're big money. $3 billion peak sales. They're, again, always listed when you look at annual reports as one of their big sellers, right? Other than cardiovascular meds, the next one is antidepressants and antipsychotics. Those are big money. So if you look at whether they work or not, and this is one of the meta-analysis done in JAMA 2010 by a fellow by the name of Fournier. He looked at basically randomized placebo-controlled trials and looked at, compared the effectiveness versus the severity of the depression. And this is what he found. If you look at the gray dots, they're antidepressants. The white dots are the placebo. And you can see for mild cases of depression, really there's no difference. For more severe cases of antidepressant, first of all, the data is much more sparse, but it's possible that there is some effectiveness. But at the lower side, you can see that the gray circles and the white circles essentially overlap. It's not really effective if you're not really depressed. And their conclusion was that the true drug effect was non-existent to negligible amongst depressed patients with mild, moderate, and even severe baseline symptoms, whereas they were large for patients with very severe symptoms. So if you're really, really depressed, yeah, it works. If anything other than that, it basically doesn't work any better than a placebo. And that kind of makes sense. If you're taking a shower and you just showered like 2 minutes ago, you're not very dirty, it doesn't do anything. But if you showered like a week ago, yeah, that's very effective. If somebody's sad because their dog died, that antidepressant's not going to be effective unless that drug will bring their dog back to life, right? It doesn't make any sense. If you're sad because you're on dialysis, the antidepressant isn't going to make you less sad. It was the dialysis that's making you sad. But that's too bad. You just got to deal with that. The majority of PACE-treated patients don't have major depressive episodes, as defined by the DSM-4. So why are so many patients treated on these antidepressants? And again, it gets to really the heart of the matter, which is how you can cover up evidence, which is, I think, one of the very important papers that have been published, which was in the New England Journal in 2008, looking at selective publication of antidepressant trials and its influence on apparent efficacy. So if you remember back to the previous example of antipsychotics, You had 15 trials, 9 of which were unpublished. Do you have the same sort of thing with antidepressants? So you know, of course, everybody loves evidence-based medicine. However, evidence-based medicine is only valuable if the evidence base is complete and it's unbiased. If you selectively publish those trials which look good, then you're going to get an unrealistic estimate of how effective the drug is. So what they did, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, they operate a registry. So drug companies have to register all the trials that they're going to do. So what they did is they took the studies from the FDA and they looked at these 12 antidepressant agents. And they said, we're going to look at everything, the published and the unpublished trials. So they found 74 FDA-registered studies, of which 23 were not published. The sample size, there was no difference in sample size between the published and unpublished. And they made their own determination as to whether the trial was considered positive, questionable, or negative. And what you can find is that 51% of the studies were positive, and 49% were negative or questionable. It's basically a flip of the coin. It's not that everything's so positive. When you actually look at all the trials in an unbiased fashion, what you find is that half of them are positive and half of them are negative. The studies, though, that the FDA judged as positive were 12 times more likely to be published. So let's look at this. So of 38 trials which were positive, 37 of 38 wound up being published. One did not. But look at those other ones which are questionable and negative. Only 3 actually got published the way the FDA, which is unbiased, presumably, interpreted. 3 out of 37 got published as a negative trial. Everything else either didn't get published or got spun off as a positive trial. So where you think, when you read the evidence, that almost all the trials say that antidepressants work, it's not true. Because all the trials which say they don't work, you haven't seen. It's kind of like you flip a coin, right? And every time it comes tails, it says, oh, that doesn't count. And every time it turns heads, it's like, yep, that's me. And it's like, I'm a really good head flipper on the coin, because every time I flip it, it comes up heads. That's what you would think if you read the evidence, but it's not true. What is true is that the antidepressants work half the time and half the time they don't. If you look at the number of patients that are included in these trials, so out of the ones in the positive, there's 7,155, 99% of the patients in those trials were published. Of the ones which are negative, only 197 were truly represented. So 6% of the patients in negative trials were actually represented to physicians, to whoever is making the decision. We'll get to that at the end. We can get to that at the end of the talk. If you look further at this paper, you can see that this is the number of trials that were published, which were positive, which were negative, broken down by the actual drug. So if you look at a drug that you might think is effective, say the number 2, Celexa, 2 trials are positive and 3 trials are negative. You look at the number of patients, 500 and odd patients seem to have benefited. Those trial patients benefited, and about 400 odd did not. Perhaps you think where Paxil is effective, 2, 4, 6, 7 which are positive, and like 9 that are negative, 9 trials that are negative. So only the positive trials are published, right? So if you read the data, you'd say, oh, all 7 trials that I saw on Paxil are positive. Well, you don't know about those 9 that were negative. Something like Zoloft, 1 positive and 4 negative. You can go down on any of them. Effexor, 4 positive, 2 negative. Remeron, 5 positive, 5 negative. You get a vastly different sense of how effective these drugs are when you actually look at the whole evidence base. So their conclusions were, there's a strong bias towards publication of positive trials. The studies that were not positive were likely to be published in a way that conveyed a positive outcome. According to published literature, nearly all trials showed positive outcomes, whereas in truth only about 50% did, which is really not much better than a flip of a coin. So these antidepressants, which we're spending billions and billions of dollars on, are just not that effective. If you think it's limited to antidepressants and antipsychotics, it's not really. If you take stroke, for instance, this fellow in the publication Trials, he looked at all trials of strokes, and he looked at which were not published. So he identified 940 trials, of which 125 were not published. Now, we don't know whether they're positive or negative. He can't go into that. But what is interesting, he's saying, is that these unpublished trials include more than 16,000 patients. I mean, think about that for a second. I mean, the trial which we base giving TPA on is like 300 patients per arm, right? Here you have unpublished data, which is like encompassing 16,000 patients. So there's a lot of data that you're not seeing. Is it positive? Is it negative? You can't say, but there's a lot of stuff you're missing here. They looked at another fellow in 2009, Ross et al., looked at all trials which were registered, and only 40% of them, 46% of them, wound up being published. Now, not all of them are going to be published, clearly, but clearly there's a huge amount of data which is under the surface which we're not seeing. The other thing, the other way, not only can you selectively publish the good stuff, you can actually change a lot of things in the trial to spin it. So if you remember from the depression, a lot of the negative trials wound up being spun as positive trials. So in JAMA 2009, this fellow Mathieu et al., he looked at clinicaltrials.gov. And what it is since about 2004, all drug trials have to be registered. So when you register your trial, you say, this is what I'm doing, this is the outcome I'm looking for, and this is what my trial intervention. So first of all, very few were adequately registered. Only about 45.5% actually were registered, so where they say, this is my outcome before I actually publish it. So if you look at those that have been registered, what they found is that there are discrepancies in about 31% of the published papers. So about a third of the trials that you're reading have been altered from when they initially were conceived. And almost all of those differences favor reporting statistically favorable results. In other words, a third of the trials that you read, that you base your decision on, have been altered. And how do they alter them? Well, what do? What they do is they change, they have a new primary outcome, for instance. So something which they didn't think was important but turned up positive, they suddenly turned that into the primary outcome. If the primary outcome was negative, they suddenly deleted it. So the primary outcome is no longer the primary outcome. They're just not going to look at it. Some of them didn't even mention it. The fourth line, different timing of assessment. If the 2-year doesn't work, well, then you take the 6-month. And you publish that as a positive 6-month. If the 6-month doesn't work, then you take the 5-year. If that doesn't work, you look at the 9 months. That's another way they do it. They publish primary outcomes, which were actually secondary outcomes. And these things happen all the time. This is all trials which have been published. A third of them have been changed so that they appear like there's something new going on. But there's not. So this is the whole thing about evidence-based medicine, is that it depends on knowing not only the positive results, but the negative results. So the systemic massive underreporting or suppression of negative trials actually results in a massive positive bias towards the use of drugs. So not only are negative drug trials not published, when they are negative, they are spun out as positive. So even though these drugs are completely not effective, you think that they are effective because they said that they were looking at one outcome when they really weren't. They were looking at something completely different, but when something else popped up, they did it. So not only is the evidence-based bias, it is completely, massively biased towards using these drugs. So where does that leave us, really? If you can look at things such as clinical guidelines, review articles, those are still valid, right? Because these are like expert doctors. So this has also been a kind of hot topic issue in the press recently, which is called medical ghostwriting. So in the New York Times, the first time I saw this is the headline was, "Merck wrote drug studies for doctors." And what they said was the drug maker Merck drafted dozens of research studies for a best-selling drug, then lined up prestigious doctors to put their names on the report before publication. Well, that just doesn't seem right somehow. In fact, it's been around for a long time. So even if you go back to 1998, this fellow Flanagan mailed confidential surveys to 809 authors. And this isn't some rinky-dink articles. These are like Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, and the New England Journal of Medicine. So they asked them basically, are there other people writing it? And about 19% of it had evidence of honorary authors. A lot of these people who are writing these, 38% are actually ranked as professor, and 69% report having published at least 10 articles. So a lot of these people publish over and over again, and they take articles which is written by somebody else and stuck their name on it. So these ghostwriters are often employed actually by medical communications agencies which are employed by the big pharmaceutical companies. So this is what they found. So not only is it in the New England Journal, but all of them. The American Journal of Cardiology, Annals of Internal Medicine, JAMA, 25% are actually have other authors that are not acknowledged on it. Ghost authors means they wrote the whole damn thing, and the other guy just stuck his name on it. And you can see like 10% and 13% in the American Journal of Medicine, New England Journal, 16% of it. I mean, you can look at case studies. You can look at cases that have come up to light, mostly through litigation. So there's been a lot of litigation on drugs recently, and actually have unearthed a lot of data about what happens. So, for instance, this fellow, Alex J. Brown, an associate professor, in 2001, he said he published this article, a review article looking at the use of synthetic vitamin D in the American Journal of Kidney Disease. Recently, this other freelance medical writer used it as a sample of his work. Now, this guy wasn't noted anywhere in the article. When they finally tracked him down, Dr. Brown actually said, oh, Abbott asked him to write the article, but he didn't have the time. So he got it written for him and stuck his name on it. So what you think is an expert medical opinion from Dr. Brown is actually an expert medical opinion from the guy making the vitamin D, who's trying to get you to prescribe it. And these articles actually cost $30,000 or more. So in the New England Journal of Medicine, they actually admitted in 2000 that they highlighted the advantages of Vioxx, but they omitted information about heart attacks. This all came up during the litigation. And the journal has said that the deletions were made from somebody working from a Merck computer. So, if you might imagine, this article, which is telling you how good Vioxx is, which is made by Merck, somebody at Merck actually reviewed the review article, deleted all the stuff about heart attacks, and got it published. So when you read it in the New England Journal, our most prestigious journal we have, you don't think that there's any problem with heart disease because nobody mentioned it, because the guy at Merck took it out. The Annals of Internal Medicine, another very prestigious journal, announced that it had, quote, tightened its policy on writer disclosure this year after a University of Arizona professor listed as the lead author of a Vioxx article in 2003 said he had little to do with the research in it. I mean, this is a publication he has put his name on publicly. He had almost nothing. He's admitted that he's had almost nothing to do with it. In fact, the whole thing was written by Merck. He just stuck his name on it. So what you think is an unbiased, academically inclined physician who's doing this study for the good of mankind is written by the drug company. And the problem is that some people think that, well, everybody wins. The academic scientists, they pile up these high-profile articles, the main currency of advancement, right? You publish a lot, you get promoted. The journal editors get really good written articles that look really good because they take a lot of time and it costs a lot of money. The medical writers get a job. The pharmaceuticals companies, they get to put these kind of infomercials in the New England Journal of Medicine. The problem is that people are dying. Lots of people are dying. If you look at Zoloft, so another case study of antidepressants, they also, in another lawsuit, they also had articles which were turned up with the author listed as to be determined. So the whole article was written. Just at the end, they have the author. They need to fill in the author. And eventually it got published in publications such as JAMA. In the British Medical Journal on painkillers and asthma, they had this lead author, which she said she did the analysis and drafted the paper. Later on, GlaxoSmithKline later confirmed that they paid a medical writer to draft the manuscript. So they had the whole thing written. She just put her name on it, and surprise, surprise, GSK makes acetaminophen in the UK, and the article had concluded that acetaminophen was much safer for asthma patients than other analgesics. In the kidney area, you can see that this medical writer had actually spoken to somebody. They had Johnson & Johnson had done a study looking at the use of once-a-week EPREX, and their actual response rate was 63.2%. But she actually had was given instructions by the drug company to make it look like 79.3% of it was doing it. And she did it by kind of moving it through. But she saved the instruction sheet and the report that were later verified by a third party. And in the end, it wound up getting published in 2004 in the journal Clinical Nephrology, highlighting the 79.3%. So in fact, you think that almost 80% of your patients are benefiting, but they're not. It was just fudged. But the lead author was this other guy, Paul Barré. Like, who is this guy? He's not even on the whole thing. He just puts his name on at the end of the trial so that he gets credit for this study. Dr. Adrienne Few-Bergman actually had written an article about ghostwriting in the Journal of Internal Medicine. What was funny was that she had received an email from AstraZeneca, which had offered her a chance to get credit for writing an article. They said, "We will forward you a draft for your input so that you would only need to review and then advise us of any changes." So they had the title, the article, even the suggestion as to which journal articles you should submit it to. She refused. And then later, because she's a peer reviewer, the exact same article came back to her to review. Meaning that they had sent it to somebody else who was a little bit more compliant and put his name on it. It was the exact same article. So she wrote about it in her in the Journal of General Internal Medicine. So even though the physicians may make changes, the thing is that these are all written with a certain bias towards, whatever the drug company is paying for. But you don't think that if you were just to look at the author. So the case of Neurontin, actually there was a lot of litigation on Neurontin as well. To go back a little bit in the history of Neurontin, in 1993 the FDA had approved this as a seizure drug. Now that's a pretty small niche market. It's not going to sell very much if you're only going to prescribe it for partial complex seizures, right? In 1996, a former employee files a whistleblower lawsuit for illegal marketing for off-label uses. And finally, in 2004, Werner Lambert, later bought out by Pfizer, admitted the guilt and agreed to pay $430 million for criminal and civil liability. So what you need to know is that drug reps are not allowed to promote off-label uses. But there are other ways to get people to use it off-label. One of them is through continuing medical education, lectures, dinner lectures, and so on. The other thing is to get speakers. The other thing is to get them into journal articles. So eventually, approximately 90% of gabapentin wound up being used for off-label uses, and it peaked at about $3 billion, so a lot of money. If you look at the actual use, which was seizures, that's the bottom part here, it stays the same. Nobody's using it for seizures. In case that's the case right now. Everybody's using it for psychiatric disorders, migraines, pain, neuropathic pain. That is not what it is licensed for. So in this article in the Annals of Internal Medicine, they actually reviewed about 8,000 pages, internal documents, as a result of this litigation. So all this stuff is normally hidden from view. Like, you'd never know about it. but the only reason people know about it is because of these lawsuits. And what they found was that the framework of promoting these sort of things like Neurontin, yes, at the top you have clear promotional intent. So you send the drug rep, the doctor knows, okay, this is a drug rep, he's biased. There's a whole lot with mixed promotional intent, so medical liaisons, patient education, directly sponsored continuing medical education. And there's a whole lot at the bottom with hidden or unclear promotional intent, of which a lot is research and publications. There's also educational grants. Okay, so a lot of money is actually being spent on research and publications by the drug company. It's not some neurologist at the U of T who decides he's doing a trial on Neurontin. It's actually conceived of and paid for by the drug company. So not only do you have heavy use of these kind of medical education things, but they also ordered several clinical trials. And these were pulled from actual memos from the company. And they said the results of the recommended exploratory trials in neuropathic pain, if positive, will be publicized in medical congresses and published. That is, you can order like 5 or 10 trials, you just take the 3 that are positive and you publish them. Forget about the 7 that were negative, you don't need to publish them, right? The drug company ordered it, the drug company doesn't have to do anything with it, they own it. And so in nearly identical trials, the quote and unquote core marketing team had concluded that the results of the negative trial will not be published. So is this made by the editors of the annals? No, it's made by the drug company. The negative trials don't get published. The positive trial, though, did get published. What they found was that in this case of Warner Lambert, they actually had paid $144,000 to produce 12 articles favorable to the off-label uses. So each of them had pre-specified topics, target journals, titles, and a list of potential authors to be chosen at the discretion of Parke-Davis. So they had written the article, they paid for the article, they know the journal, they know the title, they just need the name of the doctor to put his name on it. And then you can get it published. So the medical education company then pays the author, actually, or physicians and pharmacists, $1,000 for signing on as the author. Even though they didn't write the damn thing, they will claim that they are the author. So all articles were submitted will include a consistent message with particular interest in proper dosing and titration, as well as emerging off-label uses. So that's taken directly from the company. This is what they want. Of course they want that. So among the 7 publications which they actually found, 4 were favorable, 3 were neutral, and the topics included gabapentin for treatment of pain and tremor, a large case series. Treatment of chronic pain with anti-epileptic drugs, a new era, gabapentin and lamotrigine, novel treatments for mood and anxiety disorder. So if you're reading these articles, you think that Neurontin is great for treatment of neuropathic pain. In fact, it probably does nothing at all. So in essence, what they did was a couple of things. They used selective publication, so they published the stuff that was good and didn't publish the stuff that was bad. They also used a lot of ghostwriters to substantially alter the body of evidence to promote the use of its drug, and then they paid these same authors to speak at different events. They also delayed publications of studies that found no benefits. They spun these negative data into more positive, in a positive light, and then they bundled negative trials with positive trials to neutralize them. There's another case of Neurontin where this doctor, called Dr. Reckless, who was the outside investigator, he really wanted to publish it. And basically they squashed it. They said, I think we can limit the potential downside of the 224 study by delaying publication as long as possible. That was the Neurontin team leader, right? The drug company. So they finally did delay it by about 3 years. So even after settlement, Pfizer still made a lot of money on it, though. When they finally reviewed it all, Dr. Dickinson at Johns Hopkins, he reviewed 21 studies looking at treatment of Neurontin for these off-label uses. 5 were positive and 16 were negative. So 3 times as many trials showed that there's no benefit. Of the 5 positive trials, 4 were published. Of the 16 negative, only 6 were published, but only 2 in abbreviated manner. So if you read the literature, you'd say, well, some are for, some are against. What's the harm? But in truth, the overwhelming majority of these trials show that Neurontin is not effective. But we're still using Neurontin for treatment of neuropathic pain today. Now, in 2004, they admitted criminal liability. So not just civil liability, but they are like criminals for promoting this. And yet, we haven't learned yet, here in 2012, that Neurontin doesn't work. We're still using it. We're still prescribing it. There's lots of people on it for diabetic neuropathy, neuropathic pain. It doesn't work. The case of Vioxx is also very interesting because they actually, in JAMA 2008, this fellow Ross et al. Also looked at, he sourced data from all the original court documents from the litigation, and he was basically looking at it. And what he found was that the Merck scientists, not surprisingly, were found working to prepare manuscripts, and then they subsequently recruit these external authors, academically affiliated, to collaborate as guest authors. So the first and second and third authors actually became academically affiliated investigators. So for instance, if you look at this, which was their draft, you can see this is the Merck version. Rofecoxib does not delay the onset of Alzheimer's disease. And the first thing is external author, question mark. They need an author to put on this thing, right? By the time it actually gets published, it becomes a randomized double-blind study of rofecoxib in patients with mild cognitive impairment. All of a sudden, this Leon J. Thal, Stephen H. Ferris, and Louis Kirby all of a sudden have done so much work in it. But you can go back and find the Merck document where they had nothing to do with any of this stuff. This is the same thing looking at, this is basically an invoice to the medical communications company asking for more publications to be ghostwritten. These are a number of the articles that they have ordered. So these are the way the drug companies ordered these things to be written, right? So at the request of John Romarkowitz, I am providing you with an update on the development and estimated delivery dates for various publications related to Vioxx. So Merck said to the medical communications company, which hires medical writer, here, I need you to write some stuff. How about Vioxx for the treatment of pain, clinical implications of drug interactions, and you can see right underneath there's an intended author, right? They didn't actually write this stuff, but we want somebody with an academic sounding name to put their name on it. And there's a lot of them. There's like 8 of them here. This is another one for cardiology, a review manuscript, #1 for cardiology audience. So they ordered Health Sciences Communication, which is the ghostwriters. They get ordered by the drug company. Here, I need an article targeted towards cardiologists on the benefit of, I'm not sure what they're pushing here, but it's they need 20 pages, double space, plus references and charts. Number of revisions, they get 2 revisions. So then in 2003, the Advantage study, which was published again in the Annals of Internal Medicine, the lead author was quoted saying, Merck designed the trial, paid for the trial, ran the trial, and they came to me after the study was completed and we said, we want your help to work on the paper. So he had substantially nothing to do with it, but at the same time, you wouldn't know that unless all of this stuff gets unearthed by litigation. So what he found in this Annals of Internal Medicine, when he went through all 8,000 pages of this data, he found that Merck had actually ordered 24 trials. 24 trials. Like, that's a huge amount of trials that all were eventually published. And each study had a Merck employee designated as the author of that first draft of the trial. 16 of the 20 eventually became published with an external, academically affiliated investigator. So you wouldn't know that Merck did the whole trial. If you look at this one is William R. Garnett, which is a PharmD at the Medical College of Virginia, and he published a paper called Clinical Implications of Drug Interactions with Coxibs. And he was the sole author. He is the only author listed, and is published in 2001 in the journal Pharmacology. And what they found when they dug through internal emails and stuff is that the medical communications company, if you look on the bottom, said not only, so Dr. Garnett says the journal article that was submitted to pharmacotherapy by Dr. William Garnett has been accepted, I believe, with revisions. He has faxed me only the reviewer's comments, but is mailing me the entire package that they sent to him. So not only did he not write the article, he was too lazy to even make the revisions himself. In fact, he sent the whole damn thing back to the company that wrote it, and they charged the drug company another $1,800 on this guy's behalf. So this guy, who's, publishing these papers, not only has nothing to do with the paper, everything is the opinion of the drug company. But you would never know it. He's the only author. This is only what you know about, right? You don't know all the other stuff that you don't know about. There were 72 published review articles which were ghostwritten by Merck. So, if you're reading these things, you'd think that, wow, there's a real consensus. All these cardiologists, this pharmacists, everybody's saying it's so good for you. That's why everybody got blindsided when it turns out it's not good for you at all, because all the evidence was manufactured by the drug company. And if you look at the case of hormone replacement therapy, of course we all know that it's pretty bad, but what you can see is that medical papers by ghostwriters pushed their therapy. Again, because it was killing people, there was a lot of litigation. And as you dig through the subpoenaed paperwork, what you can find is that the pharmaceutical companies played a major role in producing 26 scientific papers, all backing the use of hormone replacement therapy. So all these were published between 1998 and 2005, and they all emphasized the benefits of hormone replacement and de-emphasized the risk. So typically these were review papers. They appeared across 18 medical journals. So not just the big ones, but the small ones are getting all these. And you get the sense, when you're reading it, you think that there's a medical consensus of these academic doctors that hormone replacement therapy is really, really good for you. But it's not. There's no consensus at all. It's all papers written by the drug company, which are basically commercials. So this seeming medical consensus fell apart in 2002 when the big federal study, HERS, showed an increased risk of invasive breast cancer, heart disease, and stroke. So if you think that it's like just, something that's, it's a little bit of, hanky-panky, it's not. People are getting breast cancer. People are dying from these things, these drugs that we are actually prescribing. So again, you can dig through the hormone replacement, and what you find is that DesignRight, which is a medical communications agency, they were paid by Wyeth to write 30 articles for publication. So they're going to take these articles and throw them into the literature. And then all of these have these 14-page outline with the author listed as to be determined. One, for example, got sent to this Dr. Bachman, who's a professor, and her response was outline as excellent as written. So she took the whole thing, she made one correction and sent the thing practically verbatim into the journal with her name on it. So as a result, of course, everybody wound up on hormone replacement therapy, and it led to hundreds or thousands of cases of invasive breast cancer and stroke. If you think it's better now, it's not. The survey done at JAMA, which was published in the BMJ in 2011, a similar survey to 1998, and what he found was that about 21% had honorary or guest authors. So about a fifth of what you're reading is not actually written by the doctor you think is writing it, but by a drug company. So the New England Journal, which is recently celebrating 200 years of publication, 11% of it is really no more than a paid infomercial. But they don't tell you that, right? So the highest rated general internal medical journal in the world is no better than the guy selling the slap chop, right? But at least you know the guy selling you the slap chop is trying to sell you the slap chop, because here you're reading the New England Journal and you think you're getting unbiased advice, but you're not. It's just an infomercial. So the conclusions is that a couple of things. One is that evidence-based medicine, everybody loves evidence-based medicine. I think it's complete crap because the evidence that it's based on is crap. In the face of this massively biased evidence base, it's not only ineffective, but it's actually extremely, extremely dangerous, because you promote the use of dangerous drugs such as hormone replacement therapy, Vioxx, Seroquel, risperidone, and Zyprexa. At the same time you're prescribing these terribly dangerous drugs, you think you're a good doctor because you're following evidence-based medicine. There's a medical consensus that this is good. I'm doing it. I'm such a good doctor. You're not. You're killing people. In truth, a lot of academic medicine, and the problem is that not all academic medicine is bad. But because you don't know which is good and which is bad, the bad doctors who are doing this are basically tainting the whole thing. If you don't know which 10% of the New England Journal is ghostwritten, how can you believe any of it? That is the whole problem. And people are dying. All of these drugs, which we have all used a lot. I mean, my mom was on hormone replacement therapy. Everybody's mom was on hormone replacement therapy. They were dying. They were getting breast cancer. Vioxx, people were dying. Seroquel, they were dying. Risperidone, they're dying. Zyprexa, they're dying. And what else? We don't know. That's the only thing we know about. What about all those other drugs? That is the problem. One of the other things is that a lot of the CME or continuing medical education is actually pharma sponsored, right? Whether it's directly or indirectly. And all of these lectures involve telling you what to prescribe. And in fact, there's almost nobody who will tell you what you're not supposed to prescribe. Like, I think I'm the only one who ever talks about what not to prescribe, because every other lecture you go to keeps telling you all about this drug to give, or this drug to do, or this procedure to do, or this device to do. And even for something so serious as Zyprexa, hormone replacement, Vioxx, you have to get that information from like the newspaper, right? Nobody comes up to tells you or goes up on the lecture. Even if you were to go to a general internal medicine conference, nobody ever goes up and tells you, this drug is really, really bad. Let me show you why. That's the end of the talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.